While inpatient, I was placed on a different kind of medication, an SSRI, with no obvious relationship to sleep. It was given to me to treat the anxiety increasingly surrounding me in this saga, as I shut my life down. Lexapro, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, works purely on serotonin, like MDMA. Miraculously, and unexpectedly for the doctors, Lexapro finally put me to sleep. For the first 2 weeks I took it, my life was back to normal like I'd at last beaten this curse. I returned home with an enormous sense of gratitude, ready to restart my life with more passion than ever. After what I'd been through over the past 4 months, I felt I'd been handed my life back in a way that is hard to describe unless you lose it for a while. I was beaming and energized, ready to share my cure with any other victim of this rare MDMA-induced affliction. While it baffled the doctors that Lexapro put me to sleep, no one second-guessed the positive results. After all, Lexapro works by altering levels of the same monoamine that MDMA targets, serotonin, which provided a concrete clue as to what had gone wrong with me starting that night in January in the first place. I felt like I'd beaten by far the scariest thing I'd ever faced, and for 2 weeks, Lexapro was my lifesaver. But then, in a cruel twist of fate that is still hard for me to look back on now, after 2 weeks on Lexapro, as I adjusted to the SSRI effects, the insomnia came right back to what it had been. I stuck with the trial in the hope this was just a transient side effect, but by Lexapro week 7, the insomnia had gotten worse than ever. I tried other serotonin modulators like Trintellix, still nothing got me back to sleep. The magic honeymoon of Lexapro became a bittersweet memory of 2 weeks of restorative rest that disappeared as unexpectedly as it arrived. A few weeks later, in June, I was finally able to see the chief sleep neurologist at Johns Hopkins Medicine. Dr. Christopher Early, who I'd been trying to get in with for months but is booked a year in advance as the national authority on sleep science and the brain. A family friend on the Hopkins board helped get me up the list. On hearing my story, after examining the details of my chart, and consulting with his colleague at Hopkins, neurologist George Ricourt, a well-known researcher on MDMA neurotoxicity since the 90s, Dr. Early told me what I'd taken that night in Mexico caused a 1 in a million reaction in my brain. When combined with the volatile mix in my blood from all the cocaine, MDMA somehow fried my serotonin system, receptors, transmitters, or both, through a neurotoxic reaction that is exceedingly rare but utterly devastating when it occurs. Serotonin controls sleep in a way that requires a delicate balance to get the levels just right. When damaged by chemical forces, it can throw everything out of whack. This is why a few days of insomnia, anxiety, and malaise after MDMA is common, just not usually long-lasting, much less permanent. For most people, monoamine transmitters and receptors restore fairly quickly, but in rare cases, lasting, even irreversible neural damage can occur in the brain. Dr. Early told me I wasn't the first he'd seen this happen to. He also referred to cases in the medical literature about a range of neurological disorders after even one MDMA use. While certain as to the source of my insomnia from hell, before January I'd never had a problem sleeping across 43 years of life, Dr. Early couldn't tell me if it would ever get better, or what treatment might help my sleep system regenerate. He felt that Lexapro offering a 2-week solution held evident clues as to the original damage, but couldn't explain why Lexapro stopped working after 2 weeks. Not knowing if anything would ever work, with candor I appreciated. Dr. Early agreed to treat my case on an experimental basis and ordered a new week-long sleep study for more data. June gave way to July and the 6-month anniversary of my insomnia was fast approaching. As this dreary milestone neared, I became increasingly isolated and was losing hope. I hadn't been to work in months, had retreated from my private life, my mental health had crumbled, and I'd lost precious parts of my world that meant everything to me. More than $200,000 out of pocket had been spent going to the top doctors and experts in the world, including The Retreat, a boutique full-service clinic outside of Baltimore that runs $50,000 per 20 days. Whatever it took to get me better had been invested, knowing that my life and future was increasingly on the line. But despite seeking out the best of the best, no one could get me to sleep, tell me how long this hell would last, or if the incessant insomnia ever would go away. We'd also run out of new medications to try, the last one. being the narcoleptic drug Xyrem, aka GHB, the unconscious elixir famously used at P. Diddy's parties, prescribed to me by Dr. Early as an extreme last resort. Being highly controlled, only one pharmacy in the US is authorized to dispense it. Xyrem was taking forever to get approved, as it costs $25,000 per month and requires passing through a bunch of safety hoops. Sleep deprivation is a form of torture, considered to be among the worst. It makes you go crazy and not think straight. We've all experienced at some point in our lives the relentless feeling that comes after even a single sleepless night. In as little as 1 week, constant sleep deprivation breaks prisoners of war into giving up classified secrets. So by the time July came around and my unending insomnia hit the 6-month mark, I'd been broken to the core, and was becoming full-blown suicidal, still no closer to finding rest. My hopelessness was no doubt amplified by all the sleep meds, many of which carry black box warnings about triggering thoughts of self-harm. Coming from a person who in December 2023 was the happiest and most energized about the future I'd ever been in my whole life, with an awesome company I was expanding, cherished waterfront properties in Canada and on the Chesapeake I'd spent years developing to enjoy for the rest of my life, a place in the city, financial security, the perfect work-life setup, supportive mentors and colleagues all around me, and a dream job that took me to all corners of the earth. By the time July 2024 came around, the person I'd become was not recognizable as the same me. It was 2 different lives, because I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think, I couldn't engage, I couldn't talk, I couldn't feel pleasure. I was a zombie who hadn't really slept more than a couple hours a night since January. It was pure hell, far worse than anything I could have imagined would ever happen to anyone I knew, least of all, to me. I couldn't think, I couldn't engage, I couldn't talk, I couldn't feel pleasure. I was a zombie who hadn't really slept more than a couple hours a night since January. It was pure hell, far worse than anything I could have imagined would ever happen to anyone I knew, least of all, to me. So for a guy who had never been depressed, much less considered the idea of suicide, even as something I'd ever understand in other people who were suffering, I never grasped what could bring someone to that state of mind. By July, suicidal ideation had become my everyday battle. After spending the sleepless night of July 4th watching fireworks on the Baltimore skyline from my room at the retreat, remembering my old life watching fireworks the year before on the Tread Avon River among friends and family, now a distant memory of a past life when all was well, 2 mornings later, I gave up my last hope of ever getting better. There was only one sure way to stop the endless insomnia and give myself the rest I'd been so desperately seeking for 6 months. So with that hopeless goal, I tearfully scribbled a goodbye note, remembered one final time the people and life I'd been so in love with before this all started, cursed God for cursing me, and tried to K-word myself. Without going into graphic details, I partially succeeded in ways that forever changed my ability to take part in the life I once had and always wanted. I'm still here, but not in a way that feels like me, with brain trauma far beyond chemicals now that can't be solved by any medicine, no matter how far and wide I search for a cure this time. I wouldn't wish it on any human being. What I've been through feels unimaginable, horrific, and unending. They say the higher you climb, the harder you fall. The person I was in December and before now feels like a character from a distant movie that I look back to and miss. Everything, every moment, seems in the past. Like and subscribe for part 3.